G'day, Starlo here. Welcome to part 2 of my masterclass on spinning or lure casting for trout in streams and rivers. If you missed part 1, make sure you go to my Starlo Gets Real channel on YouTube and watch it. There's lots of good on-water advice in there. But in this second part, I want to really drill down into the fundamentals and the techniques needed to get the most out of what I reckon is one of the most enjoyable forms of finesse fishing on offer in the southern parts of our country. And listen, while I'm going to be concentrating on spinning or lure casting for trout in flowing water, a lot of the tips that I'm going to give you are very much applicable to spinning in lakes and dams as well, whether you do it from the shoreline or out of a boat or a kayak. Anyway, let's dive straight in by having a good look at the sort of gear that you'll need to get stuck into some great trout spinning this season. Choosing the right rod is a really important starting point. That's because a lot of the lures that we'll be casting for trout are quite light. Most of them are under 5 grams in weight. It's essential to pick a rod with a nice light tip. This helps with handling hooked fish too. It cushions the shocks that could pull hooks or even break lines. But light shouldn't mean soft or sloppy. You'll cast more accurately and enjoy your fishing much more if your rod is crisp and responsive. That means choosing a reasonable quality rod built on a fairly high modulus blank. High modulus simply means that when the rod's loaded or bent and then released, it quickly springs back to its straight position and doesn't flog backwards and forwards too much. Look for a rod that's rated for lines from about 1 kilo breaking strain up to about 3 kilos maximum, and for casting weights under 10 grams. Like I said, most of your best trout lures for casting will be half that weight or lighter. Choosing the length of your rod is a fairly personal matter, and some people like really short rods, especially if they're fishing on heavily overgrown streams with lots of trees. Personally, however, I still wouldn't go under 6 feet or 1.8 meters in length for a rod. I actually prefer rods in the 6.5 to just over 7 foot range for my trout spinning. If I was walking the shores of a big river or a lake, I might go even longer just to increase my casting distance and coverage of the water. But like I said, it's up to you. A spinning reel to match up with this rod shouldn't be any larger than a 3000 size, and in fact 1000, 2000 and 2500 reels are absolutely ideal for trout spinning. You don't need to spend a fortune on a reel for trout spinning either. Just choose something that feels smooth and has at least a few sets of bearings. If you only ever use it on trout in fresh water, it should last a lifetime. But if you take it down to the salt to chase brim, whiting, flathead or whatever, give it a good wipe over with a damp cloth afterwards and then dry it off completely before you put it away. Now, when it comes to lines, you have one major decision to make right up front. Are you going to go with monofilament line, either nylon or fluorocarbon, or with a multi-filament braided line? The majority of keen trout fishers seem to prefer monofilament, either nylon or fluorocarbon. And I can understand that. I guess I'm a little bit different because I actually choose to use fine braid most of the time. Both have their pluses and minuses, and you should probably try them both before you decide. Just remember, if you do choose braid like I usually do, you will need to add about a rod length of mono leader, and that means tying an extra knot every time you rig up. Regardless of the line you choose to use, make sure that it's nice and fine and that you keep your reel well filled up, almost to the lip of the spool. That'll make a huge difference when it comes to casting those light lures. Lines with rated breaking strains from 1 to about 4 kilos are ideal for trout spinning. Just remember though that the braided lines will generally break much higher than it says on the spool. The skinnier it is, the better it'll fish, the more hookups you'll get. But obviously you don't want to go so light that you start losing a lot of fish. The other thing about light line is it'll make your lure behave much more naturally in the water. Now, speaking of lures, there are so many different styles and models that'll catch trout in streams, rivers and lakes. As I said, there are so many different styles of lure that will catch trout, and it doesn't take too long to fill up a couple of tackle trays with them. But there are a couple of standout styles that you should definitely have a few of in your collection. First of these are what's known as the inline spinners. These consist of a little blade rotating freely on a weighted shaft with a hook trailing behind, usually a treble. Famous brands include the old French-made Selters, as well as Meps, Vibrax, Panther Martins, Jensen's, and a whole bunch of others. They all work. The only drawback with spinners is they can cause a bit of line twist over time, and that can result in tangles. If you do find your line getting twisted, trim the lure off, put it back in your tackle box, stand in a set of rapids and just feed the line out until you've got about 30 or 40 meters out in the current and let it untwist. Then wind it back between your fingers. If you're on a lake in a boat, it's easy to do, just trail it behind the boat, but it's a great way to remove line twist. You can try using a little tiny swivel or a weighted keel about 30 or 40 centimeters in front of your spinner too, but I prefer to keep it simple. Other productive casting lures for trout include spoons, jigs, winged lures or tassies, soft plastics, and a whole bunch of hard-bodied minnows, plugs and wobblers, both sinking and floating. But don't go overboard when you're starting your lure collection. Just get one or two of each in a couple of different colours, and when it comes to colour, in most situations, fairly muted natural colours are best. Your greens, browns, blacks, things like that. But make sure you've got a couple of brighter lures in your collection as well. Bright red, hot pink, orange, yellow. Some days it just seems to press their buttons. Store your lures in a couple of flat trays like this and put them in your backpack or your bum bag or your shoulder bag, whatever you're using to carry your gear when you're out on the river. Stay light, stay mobile. Make sure you also pack a bit of extra warm clothing, maybe a wet weather jacket, some food, some drinking water, and pretty important in Australia is to also make sure you've got a snake bite kit. There's only a very, very slim chance that you'll ever get bitten by a snake, but if you do, you really want to have one of these kits. And it doesn't take much to build it up into a really good little portable first aid kit to cover all sorts of eventualities. Very handy. You'll also need a quality pair of polarized sunglasses. I choose to wear Mako, but there are plenty of other good brands on the market too, but spend a few bucks on them, get a decent set, and I'd suggest going for glass lenses because they don't scratch as easily. You may want to carry a landing net, that's completely up to you, and a bit dependent on the size of the fish you're going to catch. In rough country, I find that a net can be more of a nuisance than anything else because it's constantly hanging up in the bankside vegetation, but if you don't have one, it could just cost you that fish of a lifetime. Beyond all that basic gear, there are a couple of other things that will make your trout fishing much more comfortable, and a lot of that has to do with what you wear. Waders can be great early and late in the season when the water's really cold, but during the height of summer, I actually prefer to wet wade. I just wear wading boots and long pants and get wet because it gets so hot out on our trout streams. The long pants are a good idea though, against both the thistles and the blackberries and the snakes. Think about the clothing you wear too. It's really important to wear drab colours or camouflage so that you blend in with your surroundings, which makes it harder for the trout to see you. Trout have got pretty sharp eyesight and they're easily spooked, which brings us rather neatly to an examination of our target species, the trout. There are a couple of different species of trout found in Australia, but the two that you're most likely to encounter are the rainbow trout and the brown trout. Brown trout were introduced to Australia way back in 1864. Rainbows from America's west coast followed a few decades later at the very end of the 1800s. While they happily live side by side and share many habits, there are a few subtle differences between browns and rainbows that are worth knowing about. As a rule, browns tend to prefer slightly slower flowing water than rainbows. Rainbows will happily live in the strongest of current. These two species of trout also spawn at different times. Most browns will spawn in May and June, while the rainbows spawn considerably later, from about August all the way through into November. Both species of trout prefer cool, well oxygenated and clean water, although browns are a little hardier and more tolerant than rainbows, which is why browns generally tend to fare better in our harsh climate. Neither species is particularly happy or comfortable when the water gets warm. Once it gets over 24 or 25 degrees, they're not happy at all, and a couple of days of that will start to kill them, especially the rainbows. Generally speaking, they're much more active and keen to hit your lure when the water's between about 10 and 18 or 20 degrees. While there are quite a few self-sustaining populations of trout in our waters, in many areas they need regular restocking to maintain their numbers. Several states have well-established hatcheries and stocking programs, and Victoria in particular has done an amazing job of breeding and stocking salmonids and native fish in their waterways, even including more exotic species like the attractive and aggressive tiger trout, which is a hybrid of a brown trout and a brook trout, an interesting critter. The link down below will give you a much clearer picture of where trout have been stocked in Victorian waters and how many have gone in each location. This is valuable information when you're chasing them. Naturally, there are specific rules and regulations associated with trout fishing in different jurisdictions around the country. Open and closed seasons, bag limits, size limits and gear restrictions vary from one state or territory to the other. You'll find the Victorian ones at this URL below, and you can Google any of the others. The tail of this pool, which is the bottom end of it, is reasonably shallow, but that doesn't mean there won't be fish here. In fact, I just saw one. Only a small fish, but let's see if we can interest him in the lure. Ooh, he chased it. And now he's taken off. I think he saw me. So you need to just move very slowly and carefully. You don't want to be spooking fish out of the tail of the pool and pushing them up further like I just did with that one, because it's going to spook the other fish. Being able to read a stretch of stream or river is really important when it comes to identifying the spots where trout are most likely to be holding. It's something you'll get better with over time. The important basics to know are that trout will almost always face upstream into the flow, and that they'll use any current breaks provided by boulders, logs and so on to more easily hold position in the moving water. Remember that these current breaks not only take the form of eddies behind pieces of structure, but also the pressure waves in front of them. Divide a stretch of river up in your head. You can look at it in terms of pools, runs, riffles and rapids, and have a think about where the trout are most likely to be sitting. So let's get a little bit of elevation and have a look at a typical stretch of this small high country stream. For the most part the water's shallow and clear, so resident trout will need to seek some sort of cover from predators, as well as holding spots that provide them with plenty of food. In this view the current is flowing as shown, sweeping around the bend, and any trout will be holding facing upstream into the current. The most obvious piece of structure is this distinct lip or drop-off right at the bend. The prime lie is just downstream of this lip in the deeper water under a high undercut bank. This is where the best fish in the pool is likely to be. You could possibly cast to it from here, but there are likely to be smaller trout further back in the pool. Spook them and they'll likely spook the bigger fish too. It pays to approach a spot like this with a great deal of caution, and to perhaps try casting from a fair bit further downstream, possibly back around here. This way you might be able to pick off the smaller fish first and stop them from rushing upstream to spook that larger trout that we hope's lying in the prime lie. But what happens when we move further upstream, into country with a steeper gradient, faster broken water and more rock? Well, the principles remain the same. We still need to look for those combinations of current, structure and food supply that'll appeal to the needs of the trout. Sometimes these can be fairly obvious, like the 3 inflow points into this long pool, not to mention the obvious current slick extending downstream from them. But there's also an almost completely submerged boulder just here. This provides both pressure waves and a current break that the trout can easily use to hold position. Fish them all, as well as these shrub-lined edges. All these little pockets up through here, where you've got fast water coming in at the top of them, they're just going to be sitting there waiting for food items to come down the river. As the weather and water warm up through summer, they'll seek out cooler and better oxygenated areas, and often that means they'll move towards the heads of the pools where water is plunging in from a rapid above. We can use all of this knowledge to help decide where to present our lures. 9 times out of 10, you're better off carefully working your way upstream against the flow coming from behind the trout and casting your lure up ahead or up and across and bringing it back slightly faster than the speed of the current to give it some action. Strikes can happen anywhere from the first turn of the handle right to the rod tip, so stay alert. The very best trout fishers tend to be observant and really take notice of what's going on around them. They also move cautiously to avoid detection by the fish. Walking a stream and flicking a few lures to catch a trout is a wonderful pastime. It's something that I've enjoyed ever since I was a kid. I really hope that this masterclass helps you to tap into better trout fishing this season. Until next time, this is Starlo wishing you tight lines and happy trouting.